Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent, the Lumina Foundation podcast with newsmakers and thought leaders in the field of learning and training after high school. I'm Dakota Palicki. Improving the education system doesn't just happen. It takes research, policy analysis, feasibility studies, and for those working in higher education, more and more studies before we feel comfortable to pilot something that leads to the next pilot and the next pilot. For many, the speed of change in academia is too slow and the process too exclusionary. Students themselves are often left out of these important conversations. That is until they insert themselves through organizing and advocacy to make sure their voices are heard. Our guests today are no strangers to inserting student voice into important policy and practice decisions. Through their efforts, they are making sure students are heard and accounted for in education reform. And later in today's show, we're really excited to launch a new segment called Pop Ed, where higher education and pop culture come together. It's going to be a lot of fun, so thanks for sticking with us. But first, I had a chance to catch up with Lauren Shandoval, a student at University of Michigan, whose goal to give practical advice to low-income students has turned into a massive online book and into a multi-campus movement.
So at the University of Michigan, back in January, our central student government released a affordability guide, which was about 87 pages long. They had apparently worked on it for a couple years, and the first 10 pages or so of that guide were devoted to budgeting. And it had advice that was pretty tone deaf, like, fire your maid to save money, outsource your, they said insource your chores, which is another way of saying do your own chores, which I thought was a really interesting economic term to use to describe doing your own chores. Do your laundry instead of hiring a service, which is actually pretty common at Michigan. There is a laundry truck that will come by and students pay to have their laundry done somewhere else and then brought back to them. So for, I think, the general student body, it seemed normal, but those aren't the students who are trying to save money or are worried about affordability. And so for lower income students who are actually concerned about affordability, they were pretty offended by some of the content. And they were making jokes and making comments on social media. And I figured, let's capitalize on this energy and create something. People always say, oh, it's so insightful, it's so great to hear from the students. If you're an administrator on campus or a member of staff, you could bring students into these conversations all the time. All you have to do is do outreach to them. Like I said in the panel, I really do believe in community-based participatory research and making sure that students are at the table when you're having these conversations about affordability, because there are new barriers that are surfacing all the time for students these days, and that even weren't there when recently graduated students were in college. So I think having students at the table to have those conversations and talk about the very real barriers that they've faced that might be recent, that administrators may not have faced when they went to college, and a lot of elected officials didn't face when they went to college, is really important.
Rachel Fleischer has been building advocacy and public awareness for society's most complex challenges for nearly 2 decades. Now serving as executive director of Young Invincible, Rachel leads efforts to amplify the voices of young adults to expand economic opportunity for their generation. As a national organization, Young Invincibles takes on the issues of higher education, healthcare, workforce and finances, and civic engagement. Rachel joins us from Washington, D.C. today to talk about their work in higher education. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us today. And for those who aren't familiar, can you tell us a little bit more about Young Invincibles?
You bet. And thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure. And one of my favorite things to do is talk about Young Invincibles. So I'm happy to tell you more about our organization. Many of the young people that we work with are actually college students right now. And they want to see change on their campus. They want to see change in their region. They want to see change in their state, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we do is sort of think about the particular issue that we are focusing on, whether it's mental health, whether it's voting, whether it's higher education policy. We think about what are the changes and the possibilities on your particular campus, and how can we, as Young Invincibles, give you the skills you need to go and advocate for better access to mental health on your university? And then what are the state policy opportunities to also make change along those same lines? 1 in 4 students today actually is a parent already. So what are all the things that young people can do to make sure that that campus knows, that institution knows that it expects to have a childcare option for students that is affordable, accessible, and quality? That's actually connected to a federal program called C Campus, but there are things that you can do as a young person on your campus to help make sure that your institution is taking advantage of resources that are offered up federally through the C Campus.
Today we are joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Catherine Weedle from Lumina Foundation, in a new segment we're calling Pop Ed. Pop Ed is a recurring segment that talks about the eccentric and growing overlap between higher education and pop culture. When we were talking about starting this segment, it was just really a fun kind of whiteboard idea until Catherine, who is a higher education historian and scholar, really took me to school on this. So I have a feeling she's going to do the same again. So here we go. Pop Ed. Hey, Catherine, welcome so much to the show.
Hi, Dakota. Thanks for having me. You are fulfilling a life dream to be able to talk about pop culture and higher ed. It is in my heart. So I appreciate the opportunity.
I know. I'm so excited. I was talking to someone. They're like, what is, pop ed? Like, what do you mean pop culture and higher ed? So I need you to school me. Take me to school here about all of this.
Right. So I was a student affairs practitioner. And a lot of the ways that we connected with students was what was happening in popular culture. And one of those things is that colleges, universities, higher education culture shows up in very strange and interesting ways in pop culture. And it helps to shape what the general public thinks about higher ed, who it's for, if it's for them, and what the issues are. You see that in movies and TV and music. If someone makes a comment about what's good for college, who's a college dropout, and what that means for them, what degree do you need and not need. And so I think it's just important to be aware of what are the messages that students and the general public are receiving about post-secondary education, and what are ways that we can tap into those messages to infuse some evidence in some of the practices that work for students today.
That's great. So what do you got for us? What are we talking about today then?
Yeah, so the inaugural Pop Ed segment, we have to talk about the king, someone who is a favorite around the foundation. We're talking about King Beyonce.
That's right.
So what does Beyonce have to do with higher education? So Beyonce never attended higher ed, is wildly successful, but has developed her own foundation called Be Good. And Be Good has, in conjunction with her husband, Sean Carter, through the Sean Carter Foundation, have worked together over the years to develop these wildly popular scholarship programs. So in 2017, Mrs. Knowles Carter announced the establishment of the Formation Scholars Program that gave scholarships to female students in the creative arts and music and African American studies at 4 institutions. And so this year, this summer, after her Coachella performance, which amplified HBCU culture and HBCUs broadly, she announced 2 things as a follow-up kind of to the Formation Scholars Program. First, the Homecoming Awards program that gave scholarships to qualifying HBCUs, which was then matched later on by Google and expanded from 4 to 8, right? And that was in conjunction with one of our partners, United Negro College Fund. Then she announced a collaboration with the fashion powerhouse Balmain, and proceeds went to UNCF. So while she was on tour this year, the On the Run 2 tour, she and her husband, in conjunction with their 2 foundations, announced that $1 million in scholarships to 11 exemplary high school students. And so these big scholarship programs are fantastic, right? No one is ever going to knock um, identifying students that are fantastic, doing these wonderful things in their academic careers, and how that can launch them into what happens after college. Well, what are some ways that we could leverage that attention, leverage those resources? The things that we do at Lumina Foundation is not just about the grant making, but it's also about the systemic ways in which, and the strategy that we use to change what happens in higher education. Thinking big. What could it look like to have a partnership with a family foundation like Be Good, like the Sean Carter Foundation, that brings notoriety to the communities of color, the communities that we care about, making sure that we're increasing attainment and access and completion toward things that are moving in states, in talent hubs and communities across the nation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? We were just, I was just looking at this report, a draft report that's about to come out, from Nashville, where they listened to a bunch of adult learners. And, even in Tennessee, where it's essentially, no cost community college for adults or for traditional age students, they are still saying that all these folks had all these other real life challenges, transportation. There was one adult learner who said that trying to get to their local community college via bus took 3 hours, whereas if they had access to a car, it would take 15 minutes. And so it's just those other challenges that are really keeping people back from post-secondary. And so what I hear you saying is that, like, hey, Beyonce, right? And hey, a bunch of other folks who want to follow and be like Beyonce, think about some of the other kind of non-tuition kind of supports that you might be able to use your funding for. Is that kind of what you're getting at here?
Right. So covering someone's tuition may not be as sexy,
Mm-hmm.
but it can still be transformative for someone who can't afford a bus pass to get to the community college, or someone who has a past due bill and that creates an administrative hold, and then they can't re-enroll. Those things are powerful and help us to get to completion and attainment.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was great. Thank you. And I think that's a great way to kick off this segment.
Wait, I have to do my shameless plea.
Oh, okay. Yeah. What's your shameless plea?
My shameless plea is, if anyone who is watching this, please share it with Be Good and the Sean Carter Foundation, because we would love to be in partnership to talk about these things and find ways to expand their reach and to help students in a systematic way.
Mm-hmm. Is there we need to get like a hashtag or something going on that, right? Like to try to get their attention. We should put our minds together on that one.
We should. That's going to be a communications campaign.
That's right. That's right.
That's all I have.
That was so much fun. We have to do this more often.
Yes,
Yeah.
Of course. Thank you for having me. And anytime we need to prepare for Pop Ed, I'm there.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Catherine Weedle from Lumina, doing a whole lot for us, but also our resident pop culture expert. Thanks so much, Catherine, for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see you.
Bye.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent. If you have a comment or an idea for a future show, reach us at luminafoundation.org or reach me on Twitter at Dakota Palicki. Thanks for joining us.